Yes, so first up, we have Charlotte Wood from the University of Cambridge, who's going to speak to us about perspectives from an East African museum, natural history collections, colonial legacies, and the potential of thematic approaches. So Charlotte, if you'd like to come up. There you go.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today. I'll be presenting part of my research for my MPhil in heritage studies, and a big part of that was a kind of practical approach from the Arusha Natural History Museum in Tanzania and their elephant exhibition. And it can tell us about how we might reinterpret natural science collections in the wake of all this research into colonial legacies by considering the potential of a thematic approach to curation, and how that allows us to represent a kind of multiplicity of ways of understanding nature and human and non-human interactions. So a really significant part of my research was looking at how practical matters of categorization, classification, and display are key to the question of colonial legacies. And in this regard, before I jump in, I just want to define what I actually mean when I say colonial legacies, because this can, on the one hand, mean things like biases and omissions in collections, so things like representation, so what kind of specimens you have, the collectors that are represented in the collection, but also questions of knowledge and power and universalizing Europe. So in particular, seeing European ideas as normal or natural. And here I'll show, for instance, how curation is a very cultural process and also often therefore biased, and how natural history often universalizes or neutralizes these cultural aspects through its display. So when I also refer to indigenous or non-Western approaches, I mean approaches that just in general recognize the subjectivity of natural history and do not center European ideas as something normal or neutral. Okay, so I organized my presentation around a comparison between the Arusha Museum and the Natural History Museum in London and the Powell-Cotton Museum in Kent, with a specific focus on their East African collections to show how representations of nature kind of contested between these three museums. I'll first take you through the steps of how one might approach an exhibition to identify possible biases, or essentially kind of map the cultural in a display, and then take you through the alternative and how we might challenge these kinds of historic conventions of natural historical display. And this is the museum. It's located in northern Tanzania, at the border with Kenya. It's built in an old German boma or fort, built in 1900 by a kind of military troop. And then it opened as a museum in 1987. And it's deliberately located close to all these national parks and conservation areas, since it serves both tourists and hunters, but also local border communities. And this shapes the way it uses its collection specifically to serve those border communities and advocate for kind of biocultural heritage and conservation projects with these communities. Yeah. So as a brief background, the practice of collecting and also the development of natural historical ideas has always been shaped by what we actually do with specimens when we have them. So early on, things like cabinets of curiosity, specimens were mainly collected because of interest in the object in itself, so things like beauty and aesthetics. And then we had a shift to more systematic displays, like in the Natural History Museum, Richard Owen's Index Museum, where individual specimens acted as kind of encyclopedic entries in a universal catalogue of the whole world. And then you had lots of debates about whether or not to separate these indexical series from a more public-facing exhibition series, mainly led by William Henry Flower, and the desire to have public instruction on ideas like evolutionary narratives and gradual progress. And importantly, these classifications then eventually also involved indigenous peoples. So most of all in the Pitt Rivers typological style of museum display, you had these scales from wilderness and primitivism to civilization and advancement, which were then mapped into the actual space so that when visitors moved around, they imitated the kind of flow of history and then came out into the kind of culmination of time, which was the imperial present. And then indigenous people were projected as further backwards in time. So the important thing is that time and space were mapped out in museums to literally kind of manifest these colonial hierarchies in physical distances in the museum. And within this, principles of sparsity are really important. to this sort of epistemic violence in kind of maybe technical terms, or this chronopolitics. To quote Tony Bennett, museums used well-selected specimens as merely convenient props for illustration, in which meaning is apparently spontaneously available, but is actually a calculated arrangement. So in the old Mountain Gallery here, you can see it's the positioning of these two artiodactyls next to each other that actually produces the idea of an artiodactyl, because you're inviting comparison between these two species. So it's the empty space that creates the meaning, but it's the position of the creator that makes that meaning. And the important thing is that this is a cultural choice and not neutral. And that is why the nature-culture divide is so important to the question of colonial legacies, because who has the power to define what is nature, and the way the distances between these categories have been used to alienate other ways of understanding the natural world that aren't European are also a really important colonial legacy that we have to contend with. And yeah, how do we actually then contend with this legacy? You can do a kind of cultural cartography, which I've loosely borrowed from Samuel Alberti, but here is a kind of systematic guide of what I did in my dissertation. Essentially, you make a kind of map of the way textual discourse relates to visual discourse. So where you've got labels positioned, what the labels say, but also where exactly are they in the museum and how is the museum arranged? And you can also do interviews with curators and researchers to look at the intangible boundaries of disciplines and where nature and culture are in the discourse and the way we think about nature. And this is actually a really useful practical way I found to get into this often nebulous, intangible epistemic framework of a collection. By starting with tangible biases, it allows you to kind of jump in and then analyze all these more kind of, difficult to get at intangible biases. So these are the kinds of questions then you could ask. Does each specimen have its own label? What does that say about indexes, for example? What is the order of the galleries? How is the museum laid out? Geographically, chronologically, by taxon? Are galleries progressive and sequential? Divided between living and extinct? How do you move around? And especially, where do you start and where do you end? Like, are we supposed to culminate at a certain point? Is that seen as the end of progress and time, and so on? And also, of course, what kind of biases are in all these different decisions, and what can we do about them? So here is an example of the sort of recently updated mammal gallery in the Natural History Museum. It's clearly a progressive sequence that you move along. At the same time, you have a really strong discourse on the labels throughout this progressive sequence, on kind of threats from hunters and farmers and encroaching growth in East Africa. So as an example, on labels, it says things like undisturbed forest, threat from local farmers and poachers, mountain zebra is still threatened by competition from livestock, excessive hunting and the spread of farmland have affected most species of gazelle. And I would argue that this is a clear example of the kind of chronopolitics of a museum. The displays use historical ivory and specimens, but they're presented as purely evidence of natural historical fact. Yet they are also cultural artifacts, evidence of big game hunting, colonial resource extraction, and violence as well. So it's using these same specimens to cast East Africans as sort of less developed, somewhat primitive and threatening, especially in contrast to Western knowledge and Western economic forms of production. And then it just reinforces the hierarchies of access to land and resources. So these tusks are specimens, evidence of natural historical change, yet very much cultural objects, but this progressive sequence completely erases any cultural value they might have. And specifically the cultural value that relates to imperial and social histories. In the Powell-Cotton Museum, you have an interesting example of scientific name labeling. So we've heard a lot about how dioramas are artistic and cultural artifacts, and yet you also still have scientific labels with them. And specifically here on the left, you have the kind of hunter's gaze in a way, where you literally look at a landscape. It's not that every specimen has a label, but you pick out the specimen from the landscape with a sort of scientific gaze. And there's a lot of literature on how landscape is a dominating stationary view, fixing nature as one unchangeable thing from the view of the subjective observer. This means, firstly, that this entire unpeopled wilderness is sort of taken as natural. And then the same hierarchies are reinforced in space, because these same labels here with the scientific names also have things like deforestation, development and poaching, economic pressures, permanent settlement and overgrazing, farming activity, poaching, and human population growth. So the diorama creates a vision of pristine and primordial nature, literally a vision still inherited from the 19th century, and then reinforces the myth of wild Africa, othering poachers, farmers, and in general, anyone who challenges this view that this is not a static and peopled landscape. Similarly, the wall in the other room in the museum, you have this sort of trophy wall of Powell-Cotton, who was a sort of 19th century big game hunter. They're all labeled with scientific names like a catalogue that you can then look at. But these are still cultural artifacts, we understand, because they're Powell-Cotton's the things that he hunted. So they still have a history and so on. And so at the same time, then in the same room, you have these ethnographic artifacts without any labels or systematic display. So they're in this weird ambivalent location, clearly made by someone, yet in a natural historical gallery, but not labeled. And it just sort of reinforces this binary between the civilizing practice of hunting and the primitive, destructive impact of poaching. So these examples I've just tried to show how you can do this kind of cultural cartography, and also why this is really important for challenging colonial biases. And here is a totally different approach. These are concrete elephant statues in the courtyard of the museum. They're outside, they blend into the vegetation, and they're lined by a perimeter of low fences, so visitors can move around them in any direction that they want. So what's centered here is then the elephant as a theme and not necessarily as a species. And here you can't represent the elephant then without representing all the cultural traits that give it meaning. So for example, you must use statues because you can't hunt elephants that much anymore, but you can if you pay a lot of money. But you can't use it if you want to support the argument for conservation. So already the display is imbued with the very local cultural meaning of elephant. So the exhibition can tell multiple stories, of which I'll give a few examples. So first of all, beehive fences are lined along the primitive fences, which speaks to the local context of national parks, because a lot of border communities struggle with elephants destroying crops, and beehives can be used to scare away elephants from the sound that they make, and the honey can be used to supplement income from damaged crops. So in contrast to progressive sequences, you're using the embodied experience of moving around the exhibition to make a statement about human-animal relations. The choices and display are heavily localized and designed for the community in terms of just even the materials and the way the fencing is designed. At the same time, there's also room for taxonomic interpretations, because you've got the hierarchies, which reminds me of like Richard Owen's dream to have the smallest specimen in the museum right next to the largest one. So you still have this kind of evolutionary narrative, but it's not totalizing and universal. You also have a relationship with an egret, and of course the human, non-human beehive collaboration and so on. So you have this multiplicity, and it becomes much more relevant to people since meaning is co-produced between the visitors and the museum, and it's not sort of fed to visitors. So an interview I did with a curator, for example, you have precisely this distinction that they make between types of knowledge. So they say, for instance, that one type of knowledge that you get in collections like evolution and perhaps beauty in a collection, so the framework of a collection that gives it meaning, is not what people want to know. They want to know cultural meaning, information that is changeable, individual, and cannot be captured by permanent classifications in a gallery. It is most of all cultural and opposes the stasis of one unchanging natural historical truth in East Africa. So you have specifically then the local again, seeing elephants in the village. This is this picture here on the bottom left, for example, I think just it's as if you are actually seeing the elephant in the village. So it's more curating an experience, centering the interaction between human and non-human. And this is what allows the exhibition to tell a multiplicity, because it's not saying here's one specimen, but here's what we're presenting to you is our cultural understanding of elephants, because we are in relation, we're not dominating one another. And so nature and culture are blurred. Yeah. So yeah, to summarize, we could extend our understanding of colonial legacies far beyond just, the way we've collected things and who's represented, all the way up to display, and these kinds of colonial legacies all interact with each other. Certain things were collected to be displayed in a certain way, and vice versa, and so on. So we can also think about the history of display of collections. And what's good about this is that there's many practical steps we can then take to challenge colonial legacies. and disrupt these sort of epistemic frameworks that have been embedded in our thinking and our collections by something like a cultural cartography, but also in a way to make natural history collections much more relevant, far beyond just the sciences as well. So in the general discussion on imperial histories in Britain and in Europe, natural history collections hold this really unique role being between nature and culture that can then be used to challenge internalized biases. And this tangible spatial approach is a great way to get into the mental framework that we have inherited from colonialism. And in that sense, I think natural history museums could be increasingly thought of as stewards of intangible cultural knowledge. The meaning of collections can and will change over time as they are cultural objects constituted through and by communities which museums hold in trust. Themes maybe then might be better replaced by an anthropological or archaeological idea of like stewardship, intangible cultural knowledge, or object histories. But here I just stuck with theme for elephants because I thought that would work best, but I would be interested to know if thematic approach is the right word or intangible cultural approach might be better. Yeah, I'd be interested to talk about that later. But finally, making natural sciences collections much more relevant to more people and supporting biodiversity conservation and research goes hand in hand with interrogating colonial legacies. This will only, benefit the entire project of natural history if we interrogate these histories, and it all goes, hand in hand. So in short, I hope you agree that the Arusha Elephant exhibition is in many ways a triumph. Thank you.
Many thanks, Charlotte, for a great talk. Are there any questions? Yes, Jack.
Tricky question. Thank you very much. If you were to redesign the natural museum, how would you go about that?
So just repeat the question.
Sure, yeah. So the question was, how would I redesign the mammal display in the Natural History Museum, which is the best question I've ever been asked. Thank you. Maybe I can start by saying about how it's recently been redesigned, which I really like because it just has opened up the space much more. And it really reminded me of the elephant exhibition, actually, because you can just move around it in any direction you want, where previously you were kind of forced to move around in a certain progressive way. And now you can go in any direction. So it already disrupts this kind of progressive chronology. Well, so I think the whole idea of having a mammal gallery in itself is then already a certain biased idea of like the main meaning of the whale, for example, is that it's a mammal. And so you'd have to kind of disrupt the whole idea of having one gallery dedicated to mammals in general. I think the main thing that I would take away is this narrative of the threat of economic change in Africa and threat it causes to wildlife. And I would also just tell a lot more of the social histories of a lot of the objects to say we're both telling natural histories and cultural histories here, and they're really intertwined. So the idea that we have about whales, for example, or elephants is really related to our experience of transporting and hunting elephants for ivory. And that would already kind of disrupt and just not have such a universalizing approach to museums. So that's what I would do.
Anyone else? No? Okay. Thank you, Charlotte, for an excellent talk.